For more than 30 years, Johnny Carson didn't just host The Tonight Show, he controlled it. Every night, he set the rhythm, the limits, and the unspoken rules that guests were expected to follow. Most did, but a few didn't, and when they crossed the line, even Carson felt the pressure. Behind the calm smile and perfect timing was a man constantly managing chaos. When things started to slip, Carson had a quiet signal touching his ear that told the control room an interview was about to go off the rails. These moments weren't accidents. They were tests of power. This isn't a list of outrageous celebrities for shock value. It's a study of different kinds of zero shame. Some guests broke the format. Some threatened live television itself. Some told uncomfortable truths. Others used scandal as a strategy. And each one forced Carson to respond in a different way. Carson rarely banned anyone outright. Instead, he reduced access, tightened control, or quietly removed people from the rotation. He tolerated honesty. He respected earned authority, but he had no patience for chaos that harmed others. Tonight, we're looking at the guests who pushed Johnny Carson closest to his limits, not because they embarrassed themselves, but because they weren't afraid to risk image, approval, or power. And through them, we'll see the real truth about Carson. Even when the show looked out of control, he almost never was. When Shelley Winters appeared on The Tonight Show, control didn't slowly slip away. It vanished almost immediately. The two-time Academy Award winner treated television interviews the way natural disasters treat coastlines, with unstoppable force and no concern for what was damaged along the way. Most guests followed Johnny Carson's lead. They respected the format. They understood timing. Shelley Winters did not. She treated the interview structure as a suggestion, not a rule. Before she even reached the set, the backstage atmosphere changed. Production assistants warned each other. Makeup artists dreaded being assigned to her. Guests scheduled to appear after her often saw their segments shortened or canceled entirely. Staff jokingly called it the Winters time vortex. Carson would glance at his watch just minutes into her segment and realize, with growing horror, that the show was already far behind schedule. Her stories had stories. Her digressions had digressions. It was impossible to tell where she was going or how long it would take to get there. What made Winters especially difficult wasn't just her disregard for timing. It was her comfort with making people uncomfortable. Where most guests feared awkward silences, Shelley created them deliberately. She would drop a provocative statement, political, personal, or sharply critical of another star, then stop talking and watch Carson scramble to regain control of the moment. Her oversized purse became a constant source of anxiety for producers. At any moment, Winters might dig through it and pull out photographs, letters, or personal items. Once, she famously produced a bikini on air and asked Carson if she should wear it on her next vacation. Producers admitted they tried to casually check the contents of her purse before she went on stage, but she guarded it fiercely. While audiences loved the unpredictability, the backstage reality was far less charming. According to multiple staff accounts, Winters could be openly demeaning to young employees, particularly women. Cutting remarks about appearance or intelligence were not uncommon. Carson had a personal rule. Guests could embarrass him, challenge him, or disrupt the show, but mistreating his staff crossed a line. That line was fully crossed during a now legendary appearance. After another guest made a remark about aging actresses, Winters lost her temper and threw her drink across the set on live television. Carson maintained his composure on camera, but during the commercial break, he pulled her aside. No one heard what was said, but it was the only time staff ever recalled seeing Shelley Winters genuinely shaken. When the show returned from break, she was noticeably subdued. Winters was never banned from The Tonight Show. Her star power was too valuable, but her appearances became less frequent, more tightly structured, and almost always scheduled as the final segment of the night. Carson had learned how to contain the damage. Shelley Winters didn't break Johnny Carson's rules by accident. She ignored them. And in doing so, she taught Carson an important lesson. Chaos could be tolerated, but only within limits he alone controlled. Richard Pryor regularly brought subjects to The Tonight Show that were rarely, if ever, addressed on mainstream television. He spoke openly about addiction, about multiple marriages that failed in public view, about a difficult childhood, and most importantly, about race in America with a level of directness that made network executives deeply uncomfortable. A former NBC Standards and Practices representative later recalled that executives would hold meetings before Pryor's appearances to establish clear boundaries for what could and could not be discussed. The process, he admitted, was almost absurd. The rules were meticulous. Johnny Carson would carefully relay them, and then Richard would walk out and calmly step over nearly every line that had been drawn, not out of malice, simply because he did not know how to be anyone other than himself. Perhaps the most shocking example of Pryor's complete lack of self-censorship came during an appearance in 1980, following a widely reported accident related to his drug use that left him seriously injured. While most celebrities would have avoided the subject entirely or offered a carefully sanitized explanation, Pryor addressed it head-on with his trademark brutal honesty. He sat down, looked at Johnny, and casually remarked that he had learned one important lesson: that fire was not something to be treated as entertainment. A cameraman who was present that night later remembered the audience reaction vividly. There was a collective gasp, followed by nervous laughter. Pryor didn't stop. He continued speaking openly about drug use on national television at a time when most stars would not even admit to drinking alcohol in public. It felt as though he was determined to be honest, regardless of the consequences. What made these moments especially powerful was Johnny Carson's response. Unlike his reactions to guests who caused disruption through recklessness or lack of discipline, Carson treated Pryor's deliberate boundary breaking with unmistakable respect. He seemed to recognize that beneath the shocking language and explicit subject matter was something rare and valuable: complete artistic integrity. Someone who worked closely with Carson noted that Johnny had a different expression when he was sitting across from Richard. It wasn't irritation or alarm. It was a mixture of admiration and fascination, as if he were witnessing something he deeply respected but knew he himself could never attempt. Johnny Carson had spent his entire career operating within carefully maintained boundaries. Richard Pryor erased boundaries altogether. As an artistic statement, they were opposites. And yet Johnny clearly respected Richard's freedom. That respect became most evident in how Carson handled the network pressure that followed Pryor's more controversial appearances. When executives complained about language or subject matter, Carson was known to defend Pryor forcefully, arguing that his artistic importance outweighed conventional standards of acceptability. After one particularly intense appearance, a senior NBC executive reportedly called Johnny directly to voice his concerns. According to a producer who witnessed the exchange, Johnny listened politely and then responded simply, "Richard Pryor was the most important comedian of his generation. If the network wanted him on the show, they would get all of him. If that was a problem, Johnny understood, but he would not ask Pryor to be anything less than what he was." The matter was dropped. What audiences at home could not fully appreciate was that Pryor's refusal to censor himself extended beyond shocking language or controversial topics. It reflected a deeper honesty about his own struggles. At a time when celebrities carefully managed their public images, Pryor spoke about addiction not as a resolved chapter, but as an ongoing battle, sometimes won, sometimes lost. A writer from the show later recalled that Pryor would casually mention using drugs the previous weekend or struggling to stay sober that very day. There was no pretense that everything was under control, no polished recovery narrative, just raw, sometimes uncomfortable truth about how difficult it was to be Richard Pryor on any given day. For early 1980s television, that level of authenticity was nearly revolutionary. Carson's willingness to provide a mainstream platform for Pryor's unfiltered voice marked a significant shift in what network television could accommodate. By treating Pryor with visible respect rather than as a shocking novelty, Carson helped legitimize a more honest approach to subjects that had long been considered off-limits. Johnny understood that Pryor was not pushing boundaries merely to provoke. A television historian later observed that Carson recognized Pryor was using comedy to expose deeper truths about American society, race relations, and human vulnerability. By giving that voice a national platform without demanding it be diluted, Carson played a crucial role in expanding what was possible on television. While Pryor used his lack of shame to reveal painful truths, the next guest on our list mastered an entirely different craft, transforming scandal itself into a carefully engineered personal brand. When Robin Williams appeared on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, the rules of television did not merely bend, they dissolved. Unlike guests who tested Carson through provocation or confrontation, Williams overwhelmed the show through sheer velocity. He did not sit. He bounced. He did not answer questions. He detonated them. From the moment he stepped onto the stage, it became clear that Johnny Carson was no longer hosting a conversation. He was attempting to contain a force of nature. Williams rarely waited for Carson to finish a sentence. A simple question like, "So, how are you doing?" could trigger an uninterrupted 5-minute cascade of accents, impressions, physical comedy, and free association riffs. In one appearance, Carson tried to ask about a recent film. Williams cut him off immediately, launching into a rapid-fire sequence that jumped from a Scottish tour guide to a hyperactive auctioneer to a maniacal Popeye, all without pause. At one point, Carson leaned back, laughed helplessly, and said into the microphone, "I'll just sit here until he needs oxygen." What separated Williams from every other chaotic guest was that none of it was planned. Unlike Don Rickles' calculated insults or Zsa Zsa Gabor's curated scandals, Williams was improvising at the speed of thought. A producer recalled that no one in the control room even attempted to predict what he might do next. "We didn't cue cameras," one director said. "We chased him." Williams moved so erratically that cameramen were forced to abandon standard framing just to keep him in the shot. Carson, for his part, adapted in a way he rarely had to with any other guest. He stopped steering. He stopped redirecting. He let Williams run. On several occasions, Johnny could be seen glancing toward the audience, eyebrows raised, as if silently acknowledging, "You're seeing this too, right?" When Williams finally paused for breath, Carson would slip in a single dry line, "Do you rehearse any of this?" Only to be immediately swallowed again by another manic burst. Some of the most memorable moments came when Williams turned his attention directly on Carson, grabbing Johnny's tie, climbing onto his desk, or mimicking his Midwestern cadence. Williams treated the host not as an authority figure, but as raw material. In one appearance, after impersonating Carson himself, Williams abruptly stopped and said, "This man, right here, this is the Mount Rushmore of timing." It was the rare moment of clarity, and Carson felt it. He smiled, nodded, and quietly said, "Thank you," before Williams immediately derailed the sentiment with a chimpanzee impression. Behind the scenes, reactions were mixed. Network executives were nervous. Standards and practices hated Williams because he was impossible to censor in real time. One NBC memo reportedly described him as brilliant but uncontrollable. Yet Carson insisted on booking him repeatedly. A senior producer later explained why. Johnny knew genius when he saw it. Robin wasn't being disruptive. He was operating on a different frequency. What made Williams especially dangerous for television was not that he crossed boundaries deliberately, but that he often didn't see them. He would leap into physical bits that endangered cameras, knock over furniture, or shout lines that forced producers to ride the delay button aggressively. And yet, audiences adored him. Ratings spiked whenever he appeared. Viewers weren't watching a talk show anymore, they were watching a mind in real time. Carson became Williams' anchor. Without trying to dominate him, Johnny provided the one stable presence in the storm. He allowed the chaos but remained calm, steady, unflappable. A writer once observed that Carson's greatest skill was knowing when not to perform. With Williams, Johnny understood that the best contribution he could make was restraint. Despite the wildness, there was deep mutual respect. Williams frequently credited Carson for giving him his earliest national exposure. In one quieter moment, after finally sitting still, Williams looked at Johnny and said, "You let us weird ones on. That matters." Carson replied simply, "You earned it." It was a rare exchange of sincerity in an otherwise anarchic segment. Robin Williams never embarrassed Carson, never challenged his authority, and never broke trust. He broke structure. He shattered pacing. He rewired the rhythm of late-night television every time he appeared. And Carson allowed it because he understood that what the audience was witnessing was not disorder, it was creation happening live. In a lineup of guests who pushed boundaries through scandal, provocation, or confrontation, Robin Williams pushed them through brilliance. He did not aim to shock. He did not aim to rebel. He simply could not slow down. And in doing so, he expanded what live television could be. But even Williams' joyous chaos had its limits. Because the final category of guests did not overwhelm Carson with talent or courage, they exposed something far more dangerous, the moment when control slipped entirely out of everyone's hands. When Bette Davis settled into the guest chair on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, the atmosphere in Studio One shifted immediately. This was not a star there to promote a film, and it was not a guest waiting to be guided by Johnny Carson. This was Hollywood royalty arriving with nothing left to prove. 2 Academy Awards, decades of landmark performances, and an unshakable place in film history had carried Davis to a rare position. She could say anything she wanted, and everyone in the room knew it. Unlike younger guests, still protecting their careers, Davis had no interest in pleasing anyone. During one appearance, when Carson asked about aging in the film industry, she responded without hesitation, "Growing old in Hollywood is like being thrown out with the trash." The audience audibly gasped before the room fell quiet. This was not a joke crafted for shock value. It was delivered calmly as a statement of lived experience. Across multiple appearances, Davis repeatedly violated one of network television's most carefully observed unwritten rules: do not name names. She did exactly that. She openly criticized directors, producers, and former collaborators, often with surgical precision. A former NBC Standards and Practices employee later recalled that whenever Davis began a sentence with something like, "Let me tell you about that bastard," the control room would immediately prepare to cut to Carson's reaction, buying time in case the comment crossed into legal danger. Davis knew precisely what she was doing. She spoke slowly, deliberately, and paused just long enough to make it clear she could go much further if she chose. In another appearance, when discussing a famous director she had worked with, she delivered a line that became legendary among staff. He mistook having a camera for having talent. The sentence landed cleanly. The audience did not laugh. They applauded. Johnny Carson's response to Davis was markedly different from how he handled other difficult guests. He did not rush to change the subject, and he did not diffuse her comments with humor. Most of the time, he simply listened. A director who worked on several of her episodes explained it plainly. Johnny understood what the audience understood. When Bette Davis talks about Hollywood, you shut up and listen. When Carson did intervene, it was subtle, a gentle shift in tone rather than an attempt at control. What set Davis apart was not bitterness, but authority. There was no sense that she was seeking attention or headlines. Her comments felt like conclusions drawn after decades of being celebrated, exploited, discarded, and remembered again. A television critic later described this phase of her life as her period of magnificent honesty, when she no longer felt obligated to protect the illusions Hollywood preferred to maintain. Carson respected that completely. He recognized that Davis was not creating chaos. She was offering testimony. While other guests crossed boundaries through impulse or lack of discipline, Davis crossed them because she believed someone needed to say what she was saying. And unlike guests who earned quiet restrictions behind the scenes, Davis was never considered a problem. She was considered a privilege. Bette Davis's appearances on The Tonight Show were not explosive in the way some guests were. They were unsettling in a different way. They forced the audience to confront uncomfortable truths spoken by someone who had earned the right to speak them. This was shamelessness of an entirely different kind. Not reckless, not performative, but fearless, born from a lifetime lived without apology. And yet, even Davis's unapologetic candor did not prepare Carson for what came next, because the next guest would not simply speak uncomfortable truths. He would turn America's most powerful television host into the target of his comedy, right to his face. When Zsa Zsa Gabor stepped onto the stage of The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, wrapped in diamonds and perfume, the audience was not witnessing a casual interview but a carefully controlled performance. From the first moment she sat down, Gabor leaned into her exaggerated Hungarian accent and flamboyant delivery, turning what would normally be considered indiscretion into spectacle. A producer later described her appearances as professionally engineered shamelessness, and that description fit perfectly. Nothing about her presence felt accidental. She did not wander into controversy. She presented it, polished and rehearsed, as her primary offering. Unlike guests who appeared genuinely unfiltered, Gabor's shock value was calculated. She had long understood that her private life could generate more attention than her acting career, especially as roles became scarce. Rather than hide it, she reframed it as entertainment. She spoke openly and casually about her many marriages, her divorces, her wealth, and her romantic life, treating subjects that were still considered taboo on network television as light conversation. Each revelation appeared spontaneous, but those who worked behind the scenes later revealed that she always arrived knowing exactly which story she intended to tell, which former husband would be mocked, and which remark would produce headlines the following morning. Johnny Carson recognized this immediately and adjusted his role accordingly. Rather than attempting to rein her in, he became her ideal counterpart, reacting with exaggerated surprise to comments he clearly anticipated. At times, he would shake his head or glance toward the audience, acknowledging the performance without ever breaking control of the show. Their exchanges followed an unspoken agreement. Gabor would push boundaries within a range that was understood, and Carson would respond with carefully measured disbelief. The result was a kind of theatrical dance, one that allowed Gabor to appear outrageous while keeping the program firmly in Carson's hands. What made her appearances particularly striking was her treatment of marriage and divorce. At a time when divorce still carried heavy stigma, especially for women, Gabor did not express regret or embarrassment. She spoke about her former husbands with dismissive humor, compared their shortcomings openly, and treated financial settlements as casual anecdotes. She even framed her divorces as personal victories rather than failures, transforming them into comedy and branding. The audience laughed, but the underlying shock was real. She was not asking for approval. She was declaring independence from expectations that no longer served her. Her flirtation with Carson followed the same pattern. Unlike most female guests who maintained strict professional boundaries, Gabor openly teased the host, touching his arm and making suggestive remarks with practiced ease. Carson responded with visible amusement and controlled embarrassment, fully aware that this too was part of the act. He enjoyed the performance without mistaking it for sincerity. Behind the glamour and exaggeration was a sharp understanding of celebrity economics, and Carson treated her accordingly, not as a chaotic guest but as a skilled performer playing a role. That role proved remarkably durable. In an industry that routinely discarded aging actresses, Gabor created a persona that became more valuable with time. Each divorce, lawsuit, or public controversy expanded her relevance instead of diminishing it. A producer who worked closely with Carson later recalled him describing her as completely artificial and completely authentic at the same time. It was not a criticism, it was recognition that she had created a character and committed to it fully, because that character had become her livelihood. As the segment drew to a close, Carson attempted to steer the conversation towards safer territory, but Gabor remained firmly in control of her image. She made it clear, in her own way, that scandal was not something to be survived, but something to be used. Carson understood that distinction, and he respected it. Where some guests crossed lines because they lacked restraint, Gabor crossed them because she had calculated exactly how far she could go. If Richard Pryor used raw honesty to expose uncomfortable truths, Zsa Zsa Gabor used calculated shamelessness to turn controversy into currency. And while her performances remained controlled and deliberate, the next guest would demonstrate what happened when control disappeared entirely, turning a routine appearance into a moment so volatile that Johnny Carson was forced to intervene. When Oliver Reed stepped onto the stage of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson in July 1979, It was immediately clear that something was wrong. He did not walk so much as stagger. His speech was already slurred, his posture unsteady, and his eyes carried the unfocused intensity of a man struggling to appear sober while failing badly. Before a single question was asked, producers in the control room knew they were facing a live television emergency. According to a stage manager who was present that night, Reed had already consumed several bourbons backstage and was still demanding more. When a production assistant attempted to hand him water instead, Reed snapped back. "I didn't ask for bloody water, did I?" Loud enough for nearby staff to hear. This was not a guest pushing boundaries deliberately. This was a guest who had arrived without boundaries at all. Once seated, Reed immediately ignored the basic rhythm of the interview. He interrupted Carson repeatedly, drifted between unrelated topics, and began breaking into fragments of British pub songs mid-sentence. Several of the lyrics had to be censored on the delay. What began as audience amusement quickly shifted into visible discomfort. A camera operator later described it as watching a slow-motion car crash while knowing you're live and can't look away. At one point, Reed launched into a rambling story about filming in Spain, only to suddenly fixate on a woman in the audience and call out, "You there in the red dress, you're a lovely bit of crackling, aren't you?" Before Carson could redirect him, Reed continued with comments that were immediately dumped by the delay system. The tension in the studio was palpable. Carson, normally the picture of control, could be seen calculating in real time. During one particularly chaotic stretch, he briefly looked into the wrong camera and mouthed what appeared to be, "Help me," toward the director. For a host who prided himself on never breaking the fourth wall, even that fleeting moment signaled how desperate the situation had become. What made Reed especially difficult to handle was that, beneath the intoxication, flashes of brilliance still emerged. In between incoherent rambling, he would suddenly deliver a sharp, articulate observation about acting or filmmaking, reminding everyone of the formidable talent buried under the alcohol. A Tonight Show writer later noted that those moments of clarity prevented Carson from simply shutting the interview down. Every time Reed seemed about to go completely off the rails, he would pull himself together just enough to make everyone hope he might recover. The breaking point came when Reed veered back into sexual commentary toward the audience. Carson immediately gave the cut signal, and the show went to commercial nearly 2 minutes early, an almost unheard-of move. During the break, Carson leaned toward Reed and said something quietly and firmly. No microphones picked it up, but multiple staff members later recalled that Reed's expression changed instantly, like a scolded schoolboy suddenly realizing how far he had gone. When the show returned from commercial, Reed was noticeably subdued. He sat more upright, answered questions briefly, and avoided further provocations. The rest of the segment passed without incident, though the earlier tension never fully dissipated. After the show, Reed reportedly apologized to Carson, mumbling explanations about jet lag and medication. The excuses were familiar, but the embarrassment appeared genuine. Despite the chaos, what stood out to those who worked that night was Carson's restraint. He never mocked Reed, never turned the situation into a joke at the actor's expense, and never openly shamed him on air. A producer later reflected that Carson could have easily humiliated Reed for laughs, but chose not to. Johnny would guide, redirect, even establish boundaries, the writer said, but he wouldn't humiliate. Reed never appeared on The Tonight Show again during Carson's tenure. Internally, his name received what staff called a permanent clipboard notation not to be booked again under any circumstances. Yet his single appearance became legendary, not because of Reed's behavior alone, but because it showcased Carson's ability to navigate genuine live television danger without sacrificing basic human dignity. Where other guests tested Carson's patience or authority, Oliver Reed tested the very limits of what live television could safely contain. And in doing so, he revealed not just the risks of shamelessness fueled by alcohol, but the quiet professionalism of a host determined to protect his show, his audience, and even his most difficult guest. When Don Rickles walked onto the stage of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, the energy in the room changed instantly. The audience leaned forward. Johnny Carson's posture tightened just slightly. Everyone knew what was coming. This was not a polite guest interview. This was a direct assault on the most powerful man in late-night television, delivered right to his face, on his own show. Unlike every other guest who treated Carson with reverence, Rickles ignored the hierarchy completely. He rarely waited for a question. He often opened by attacking Johnny's appearance, his clothes, or his personal life. "Look at you, Johnny," he would sneer, scanning Carson from head to toe. "That suit looks like you mugged a game show host on the way to work." The audience would gasp for half a second, then erupt in laughter, stunned not just by the joke, but by the audacity of saying it to Carson on national television. Rickles treated Carson not as a host, but as a target, and that inversion of power was the entire point. While other comedians carefully stayed within the unwritten rule that Johnny teased guests, not the other way around, Rickles obliterated that rule from the moment he sat down. He mocked Carson's age, his divorces, even his authority, calling him names on air that no one else would have survived, saying, "You hockey puck," Rickles would bark, or, "What are you looking at, genius?" And somehow the audience loved it. What made it work was the relationship beneath the insults. Carson understood that Rickles' attacks were not hostility, but a twisted form of respect. A producer later recalled Johnny saying, "If Don isn't insulting you, that's when you should worry." Rickles only went after people he considered worthy of his attention. Being roasted by Rickles meant you mattered. Still, even Rickles had lines, and occasionally he crossed them. Certain topics, especially Carson's divorces, were considered sensitive. During one appearance shortly after Johnny's third divorce, Rickles made a particularly sharp joke about alimony. Johnny laughed, as he always did on camera, but those who knew him well noticed the subtle change. The smile tightened, the eyes hardened slightly. During the commercial break, Carson leaned over and quietly said something to Rickles. No microphones caught it, but when they returned to air, Rickles never touched the subject again. The most serious breach came when Rickles attempted what he claimed was a tribute, but executed as an ambush. Without proper clearance, he arranged for embarrassing photos and deeply personal stories from Carson's past to be revealed live on air. Johnny had no warning. As the segment unfolded, Carson struggled to remain a good sport, but the shift was visible. According to multiple staff members, when they went to commercial, Johnny was unusually silent. Rickles tried to read the room. Carson finally spoke, calmly and directly. "That wasn't funny, Don. That was mean." It was one of the rare times Carson openly criticized a guest to their face. For a brief period, producers genuinely believed Rickles might be permanently banned. Carson was furious, not because of the jokes themselves, but because Rickles had violated trust and hijacked the show without permission. What saved Rickles was something no other guest on this list had: genuine reconciliation. Rickles apologized privately, sincerely, without excuses, and Carson, a man known to hold grudges for decades, accepted it. Their friendship endured, and Rickles returned to the show. The incident became a quiet lesson inside NBC about the limits of even the most privileged guest. Rickles' genius lay in creating the illusion of complete chaos while actually operating with precision. Though his nightclub act was famously profane, he carefully adapted his Tonight Show appearances, avoiding language and topics that would have caused immediate censorship. He knew exactly how far he could go and how far he could not. That balance allowed him to appear utterly shameless while remaining just inside the boundaries of network television. In the end, Don Rickles did something no one else could. He turned Johnny Carson into a punchline and lived to tell the tale. Not because Carson was weak, but because he was confident enough to allow it. Their exchanges remain some of the most electric moments in late-night history, proof that the sharpest comedy often comes not from safety, but from trust. But even Rickles' calculated brutality did not fully prepare Carson for what came next. Because the next guest would not insult Johnny as a joke. He would overwhelm the entire structure of the show through sheer, uncontrollable brilliance. These seven figures didn't just create controversial television moments. They revealed something far more fragile: the invisible balance between freedom and control that defined live television at its peak. Richard Pryor crossed the line with truth so raw it terrified the system. Zsa Zsa Gabor crossed it by turning scandal into survival. Oliver Reed crossed it by losing control entirely, pushing live television to the edge of collapse. Bette Davis crossed it with authority earned through experience, not shock. Don Rickles crossed it through insults built on absolute trust. Robin Williams crossed it with brilliance that moved faster than structure itself. And at the center of it all stood Johnny Carson. He wasn't the loudest voice. He wasn't the most reckless presence. But he understood something few hosts ever truly grasped. Television history isn't made by enforcing limits, but by knowing exactly when to let them bend and when they must not break. Carson didn't try to tame these guests. He framed them. He absorbed their chaos, their honesty, their danger, and transformed it into moments audiences would remember for decades. Sometimes that meant laughter. Sometimes silence. Sometimes tension so thick it could be felt through the screen. In an era before social media, before viral clips, before digital safety nets, The Tonight Show became a live experiment in human unpredictability. These 7 moments were not accidents. They were risks consciously taken, carefully held, and occasionally barely survived. And that is why they still matter. If you have a different perspective on these moments, leave a comment below. Which guest do you remember most? Or is there someone you think deserved to be on this list? Like the video if you believe these stories are worth revisiting. Share it if you think television history shouldn't be forgotten. And don't forget to subscribe to Hollywood Revisited for more untold stories, uncomfortable truths, and the moments that shaped Hollywood in ways few dared to admit.